Morning, everyone. I'm just going to wait again for a minute until people join us for this week's Learn with Lorna. So welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. My name, fairly self-explanatory, is Lorna Steele, and I am the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. This is the 22nd in the series of Learn with Lorna talks, where I share some information about different collections that we care for in our 4 offices in the Highlands, some different insights into the sorts of things we look after, how we look after them, where they're kept, and so on. And so, as I say, this is the 22nd one. We've covered subjects from transport and World War I to all sorts of other different things. And if you want to go back and have a look at the previous talks, then please do so. They're available on the videos tab of our Facebook page and also on the High Life Highland YouTube channel. And if you need to do so on the YouTube channel, you're able to switch on captions so that if you're struggling to hear me, then you can do that on the YouTube channel. It's nice to see some people already saying hello. Fiona and Brian, hello, nice to see you. Please do carry on doing that. It's lovely to see people coming in and saying where they are and where they're watching from. It's nice to see some of the same names coming up and forming a wee community of everybody saying hello to each other. It's lovely. So I'm going to open first of all by saying, as I always do, that this live cast is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and to take part in this event you don't need no subscription and there's no charge. So this week we're looking at court records, and we touched on this a little bit for Crime and Punishment Week, but this is going to be a more in-depth look at this subject and some of the stories that are found from within these collections. There are some strange stories, some slightly comedic stories, some tragic. And again, as we talked about with Asylum Week, with the poor relief records, sometimes these stories show people at a low point in their life, and it's just always worth remembering that when we're looking at them. So before I start, I'm going to say most of the court records for Scotland are held in the National Records of Scotland in Edinburgh. They hold the large series of court records. So they hold the majority of things. What we hold within Highland Archive Service are the process papers of certain courts. Now, for anyone who's familiar with the legal system, and I know that a few people who are watching may well be, there are such a wide variety of court functions and people who deal with specific aspects of law and specific subjects. So the ones I'm going to talk about today are the ones that we hold in the Highland Archive Service, the process papers of the Borough Court, the High Court, the Sheriff Court, and the JP Court. I'm going to give you a few examples from different court series. The first thing I would like to say very clearly is that I'm not a legal expert. So if there are any lawyers watching or anyone who has any legal training, I'm sure you'll be happy to correct me if I get anything wrong. But if you look back at the types of subjects we've covered in this and the types of subjects that anyone who works in an archive is dealing with day in, day out, there's no way we can be an expert in all of these subjects. So what I'm going to talk about is the collections that we care for. So please bear with me if I get something slightly wrong from a legal standpoint. As I say, what I do know about is what we hold in our collections. So that's what I'm going to chat to you about. Thank you, everyone, saying hello and saying happy birthday. That's very kind. Thank you. So yeah, I'm going to start by talking about the Borough Court. So there are hundreds and hundreds of items within our Borough Court collections. The Borough Court tends to deal with minor offences that are happening in royal boroughs. So predominantly the ones we're looking at are in Inverness Borough. They date from 1648 onwards. Now, I just think it's amazing, and I know you'll be so used to me kind of waxing lyrical about things, but Yesterday, I took part in a virtual webinar from the Guildhall in London about the Great Fire of London. This is the great thing about all these virtual events that are happening because of COVID, that you can take part in things that there's no way you would normally be able to be involved in. And I just thought it was extraordinary reading all about something from 1666, 1665, the plague, the Great Fire, and then coming to write my notes for this talk and going, I handle records from that date all the time. It's such a privilege. It really is, those big dates that you know in history, and you have something that you have a tangible connection to that dates from those times. So the Borough Court records date from 1648 onwards. Minor offences, and they abound in great fun legal terminology and Latin phrases, the language of law, of course. So there are things like disposition omnium bonorum, which apparently is to do with all the goods. So it's to do with finances. There are precognitions, which are factual statements taken from witnesses, discharges and obligations, and my personal favourite of a strange turn of phrase, horning and poinding documents. And these are the records of seizing goods to pay debts. And just interesting from a language point of view, I think that's probably where we get the word impound from poinding. So you're impounding something to pay, to take it and secure it. A lot of the Borough Court records are about debt, they're about money, they're about aliment, which is the kind of predecessor of alimony or maintenance payments. And as I said, they're minor offences. So they're things like breaches of the peace, abuse of language, minor theft, things like that. There's one for stealing fruit from an orchard, but I'm going to come back and talk about that in a second. An example from 1665 is the town of Inverness against the estate of Dinane, and that's about the cutting of peats on Dinane estate. So you can see the level of crime that's talked about within the Borough Court records. One of the things I particularly love when I was looking through our lists of Borough Court records are the amazing lists of occupations and jobs that appear. So I'm going to read some of them out because I jotted some down because I thought they're just so extraordinary, and I know it's something people have a lot of interest in. So there are some obviously that we would still know. So there's merchants, skinners for butchers, and for people skinning animals to make parchment and things. Periwig makers, salt millers, apothecaries, vintners. So some of these the words have kind of carried on. So we would recognise what a vintner was in a winemaker. That word is still used. But then there's some things here. Does anyone know what a litster is? I had to look that one up. I didn't know what career that was. That is, if you're dyeing fabric, then you are a litner, a litster. Cordoners for shoemakers, pioneers, who were people who supported the army to build fortifications and roads, dig ditches and so on, and that's where we get the word pioneers from. So these records just give us such an insight into the types of jobs people were doing, what was happening, what sort of industries were happening in the town and in the wider Highlands. And so I wanted to give you some examples from within these Borough Court records. And the first one was from 1701, and that is a warrant of commitment. So essentially, if you find this person, you can seize them, we can arrest them. Against Donald Grant, Alexander Mackay, John Henderson, Thomas Aves, and they're all merchants, and James Keelach, who was the master of the Janet of Inverness ship. And they were being sought because they had imported liquor contrary to the Act of Parliament. And so they're obviously essentially smuggling. And when we come to the Sheriff Court and High Court records, you'll see some more references to that particular crime. For anyone out with Scotland, you're maybe not familiar with the role of the Procurator Fiscal. And so before I go on and tell you some other examples, I'd like to explain as best I can the role of the Procurator Fiscal within Scotland. They have a role similar to aspects of other roles. So they have part of the role is similar to a coroner, and part of the role is similar to a prosecuting advocate. They are the public prosecutors in Scotland, and they receive and consider reports from the police and from various other organisations and institutions, and they take the decision on whether criminal proceedings should be taken against somebody in the public interest. So that's one role. Another thing they do is they're responsible for for prosecuting all criminal cases in the sheriff courts, and they're responsible for investigating all unexplained deaths, sudden deaths. So as I say, in some respects, a little bit like a coroner in England. So they have various roles, and we have various documents that talk about the Procurator Fiscal. But I've picked, how many? A couple, 3 or 4 here to touch on, to tell you about, to show the range of things that the Procurator Fiscal was involved in. There's a 1684 complaint. You'll forgive me this week, I'm looking at my notes a lot because there's a lot of different names of people who are involved, and I don't normally need to do that, but I don't want to get anybody's names wrong. So yeah, it's 1684 complaint against Alexander Ross in Leonach, and anyone who's familiar with Culloden battlefield will know Leonach is nearby there, for stealing fruit from an orchard in Drakes. Now I find that really interesting, that that's something that the Procurator Fiscal would have thought that merits a response. It's in the public interest for us to prosecute. And it's a boy. It says that he is the son of this person, and he's living with his father at this house. It's interesting that we thought that was in the public interest to prosecute. Similarly, in the same year, the Procurator Fiscal decided it was in the public interest to put a warrant out for people who, it says, sundry persons who were absent from a burial. So I'm not entirely sure under what requirement you should definitely be at a burial, but I just thought it was a very interesting document. The following year, 1685, another totally different one, a request for help from a John Simpson. So he is a sailor, and he's requesting that the court takes action against William Fraser, the master of the Adventure of Inverness. Absolutely love the ship names. Maybe we'll do a Customs and Excise week as well. I'll come back to have a look at those. And he said that William Fraser had attacked him in Rotterdam and then abandoned him and left him there with no way to get home. So in 1685, Rotterdam's quite far away, to get stuck and not be able to get back to Inverness. But obviously he'd somehow been able to contact the court. So he must have made it back and say to the court, you need to take action against William Fraser. And the last one from the Borough Court records that I wanted to highlight to you is from 1754. And that's obviously about 70, 80 years later than those ones. And this is a complaint by the Procurator Fiscal against Janet MacDonald. And she is the late servant to Alexander Ross, weaver and Chelsea pensioner. So that's interesting. We think of the Chelsea pensioners, obviously, with their red coats, based in London. Those are only the resident Chelsea pensioners. So you could be a Chelsea pensioner if you were on a war pension out with that settlement, that institution. So the complaint is against Janet MacDonald, late servant to Alexander Ross. And the crime that she has committed is fornication with a soldier. And the verdict, it says here, is that she's to be committed to prison until she pays the fine of £10, which is around £1,200 in today's money. And what I find particularly interesting is that fee of £10, the fine that she had to pay, was to be paid to the Kirk session. And if she didn't pay it, then she was to be banished from the country. If you were watching on Church Week, you'll know I talked a lot about the role of the church, the power of the church, and the amount of influence that they had in people's lives. So I find that absolutely fascinating, that the decision was made, that fornication with a soldier was and something that the courts would take an interest in as an illegal act, and then B, that the fine is to be paid to the church, because my guess is because it's the church's sensibilities that you've offended with that. That's where the breach of discipline has come in. And then again, if you fail to do so, then you'll be banished from the country. So an absolutely fascinating insight into what the community and the society held dear, what was important to them, what the values were, and who should be taking the responsibility for administering that or getting the apology. An interesting set of records, the Borough records. I'd really encourage you when if you're able to do so, if you're nearby us, to come in and have a look through them. They're absolutely extraordinary. And interesting that just the sorts of things that are happening within the town, as I say, these are talking about what's happening in the Royal Borough. A huge amount of variation of things happening. So I'm going to come on and talk about the Sheriff Court papers in a second and the High Court, but before I do so, I would like to just put in my reminder that this livecast is brought to you from High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, and High Life is a charity registered in Scotland, and the event requires no payment and no subscription. So good to put that in again. So next I'm going to have a quick talk about the Sheriff Court records. So this is essentially the next level up from the Borough Court. They're dealing with criminal and civil cases, and they're lesser crimes. So they're sort of more severe crimes than in the Borough Court records, but not to the level of being in the High Court records. So sort of in between level court. The Sheriff Court records cover a wider geographical area. So whereas until now we've been looking predominantly at Inverness and people based in Inverness, we're now, for this series of records, looking a little bit further afield. If anyone was watching in Jacobite Week, you might remember I talked about the court records for those who were caught wearing Highland dress after the Act of Prescription was passed after the Battle of Culloden. So those appear within this. This is where they sit in the record series under Sheriff Court. So there are a series of those Highland dress warrants. There are quite a few warrants of imprisonment against deserters from the army. There are things like housebreaking and theft of a higher level than in the Borough Court. Illegally bearing arms, breaking out of prison, that sort of thing. So you start to see that increase in the type of crime that's being looked at here. There are also some really interesting documents around the processes of how things happen. So there are some bonds of transportation within this collection, which are the documents that authorise ships to transport convicted prisoners to the plantations. So as I said, these are process papers, and that's what it talks about, the process of how a crime is dealt with. And then if there's been a verdict reached, someone needs to authorise, if they're to be banished or transported, someone needs to authorise that. And so those papers appear within here. There are particularly interesting ones within the Sheriff Court papers about soldiers and, as I said, deserters. But also, I wanted to read one to you from 1812. So this is obviously the height of the Napoleonic Wars. And this is against John MacDonald, who is a private in the 42nd Regiment. And he is put into prison for 1 month solitary confinement for changing his name and entering the Navy and receiving pay from the Navy as well as from the Army. Another one from the same year, from the same regiment, a soldier sentenced to 200 lashes for unsoldier-like behaviour. And that unsoldier-like behaviour was that he had attempted to defraud a local person. 200 lashes, it's not often within these records. Sometimes the punishment isn't mentioned at all because, as I say, these are process papers. They're talking about the process of getting the person arrested or getting to court. So that quite often there's no mention made of the punishment. But where it is, it's quite unusual for it to be 200 lashes mentioned within the Sheriff Court records. There are records of assault, of abandoning children, things like that. And interestingly, some warrants to arrest and confine people who were dangerously insane. Now, again, if you were watching on the week that I was talking about the asylum, you'll maybe remember that before we had the asylum, to put in people who had mental health issues, and there was no system for dealing with that, people would sometimes be arrested and put in prison because at the time they just didn't know what else to do. And so they would either be put into prison to keep people secure, to keep the person secure, or later they start to be putting people into hospitals before that huge change in understanding of mental health came in. So those records sit within the Sheriff Court records as well. There's also some you might recognise as similar to current court records. So there's one for Ewan McPherson, a chaise driver, and he is arrested for dangerous driving for running down a pedestrian in his horse and carriage. There are references within the Sheriff Courts to riots, particularly the Croy riots of 1823, people arrested for riotous assembly and assaulting ministers. And one from the early 1800s which is the arrest, and again I'm going to look at all the names to make sure I get them right, the arrest of Jean MacDonald, Elizabeth Mackenzie and Helen Mackenzie for theft. And they were released after 1 month, but Helen eventually was banished in 1812, banished from Scotland on a riot charge. So very interesting that women feature very much, probably equally or just slightly under men in these court records. Really, really interesting to me to think that. So these 3 women arrested for theft together, and then after that, one of them has been rioting as well. They do, as I said, they don't all hold information about sentences and punishments, but some of them do, and those things can give you an insight into sentencing at the time. So, for instance, there's people in for 6 weeks for theft. There's someone in for gets put into prison for 40 days for theft of potatoes. 50 days for assault. Those are some examples, but there's huge variation across that. There's no standardised sentencing, really. And I suppose that depends on the severity of the crime. You know, we might laugh at that one of someone stealing potatoes, but I suppose if the person they stole it from, if that was their entire livelihood, then that's a massive impact on the victim. And so you can see that huge variation across the sentencing. But as I said before, I find it interesting that it shows the sort of things that the society held as of particular importance, or what were people entitled to have protected. So the last set of records I want to touch on, really, I'm not going to go into the JP courts, although just as I was coming on here, literally 1 minute before, I had a look at one of the lists and I saw that there was a JP court of someone being arrested because they'd cursed against the king. And I thought, oh, well, add in a whole other section about the JP courts, but I've told you that one. So we're going to have a look quickly in the last few minutes at the High Court records. Now, as you might suppose, given the way I've been going, this is the highest level of court with looking over at criminal cases. So this is cases that are seen before a judge and jury. The High Court sits permanently in Edinburgh, but also travels round the country on a circuit round Scotland. If any of you are familiar with Rumpel, then you'll know he calls them circus judges. And these are the serious crimes. These are records of people who have committed murder, rape, treason, those very, very severe, serious criminal activity. What's of particular interest as well, I think, is that there are some records in here for lesser crimes, but it's if they've been committed by someone who's considered to be a habitual criminal. And again, another TV reference, habitual criminal always makes me think of Porridge and Ronnie Barker. But you can see right through the High Court records, that they're generally very severe crimes, serious crimes, but there are some that are lesser things. But as I say, it's probably because they knew the person to be a repeat offender or a habitual criminal, and therefore they were moving it up the chain to be taken more seriously. As would make sense with the fact that they're dealing with the most serious of crimes, they are also dealing with the heaviest of sentences. So quite often, cases that are seen in the High Court are the cases that have execution as a sentence or transportation away from Scotland. So the types of things we see here, as I've mentioned, murder, rape, and so on, but a couple to pull out for you. There are a lot of references to child murder within the High Court records, and this almost always will be abortion. There's an example from 1764 of somebody abandoning a newborn child on the steps of Phineas Mackintosh, who was at the time the Dean of Guild, so he was involved in the borough group of magistrates, and he was the person who had control over the building authorities within the town. And so someone had abandoned a newborn child on his doorstep, and it's interesting that it was a group of servants who did that. So those sorts of things. There are serious assaults can be found in here, and also forgery. So again, if you remember from Crime and Punishment Week, I spoke about a woman called Anne Jackson who had committed forgery, and when she had been arrested, she was paraded through the streets of Inverness with her hands tied behind her back and A sign. She was made to wear a sign that says, "I am an infamous forger." She was paraded through the streets before she was then banished from Scotland, never to return. So that sort of thing within the High Court records. So I wanted to pull out just a couple of examples to tell you about the severity of crimes that appear within these records. So for instance, from 1721, there is a warrant of imprisonment for John McKeon, alias Rory of Lochailsh, and he is charged with the murder of troops at Lochaffric. Now I've looked at this document, and that's really all there is in it. It just says 1721, John McKeon arrested for murder of troops at Lochaffric. 1721, my guess is this is potentially to do with Jacobites. I don't know that. But again, Lochaffric, for those of you in the Highlands, you'll know that, a very beautiful location. For those of you who don't know it, have a look, you'll recognise it as the kind of iconic image of Scotland with the loch and the hills and the pine trees and so on. I was there for a walk not that long ago, and I just thought, that's extraordinary. At some point, 300 years ago, I know what happened here. It's quite extraordinary. How was banishment carried out, Helen? People were generally, they would be transported from the Highlands usually down to London, and then quite often put on the hulk ships. If you've read Great Expectations, you'll know a description of the hulk ships that were sitting in the Thames, and then transported from there en masse out to the colonies. So to America, Australia, different places. But yeah, forced. And sometimes people would be told that they had to be banished for a period of 7 years, and then they could return if they were able to. But realistically, for a lot of these people, how are you going to be able to return? It's so far away, and odds are you probably don't have much money. And for some of them, they will have already made a better life when they got there. And for some people, if they were found back within that 7-year period in Scotland, then they would be banished permanently. So another one, from a point of view of the severity of things that can be found in these records, is from 1729, and that's a warrant of execution for Ewan McCall. And he's a smith from Achnacarry, which makes sense. McCall is quite a strong Lochaber name. And he had been committed for murder, and it says that he's to be executed, and after he's executed, he's to be hung in chains of iron. So the sort of thing you wouldn't find in the Borough Court or the Sheriff Court records. There are some examples of clemency, I'm going to say, or reduced sentences. But again, when you think about that, think what the alternative really was. So for example, there's the arrest of Angus Bain Kennedy, who was a piper in Glengarry. He was arrested for theft, and we have that warrant of imprisonment. We then have the dead warrant, which is authorising his death sentence. But then we have a remission by royal clemency for him. So he has the death sentence has been reduced, taken away. But it then says instead he's to be released to transport himself away, never to return. So of course we're glad that the execution wasn't carried out, but realistically, how great an alternative is that for someone to make their way out of Scotland and never come back? In the 1750s, there's quite a few petitions for prisoners who are requesting to be released from prison and say they'll instead serve in the Navy. And again, if anyone knows anything about the life in the Navy in the 17 and 1800s, I'm not sure that would have been as great an option as they maybe thought it might be. There are quite a few within this series of records to do with illicit distilling, to do with smuggling. One of my favourites is from 1814, and it's the arrest of William MacDonald and Archibald Chisholm of Strathglass. They're found in possession of smuggled whisky, but the real problem is that the whisky was taken away from them, but then they broke into the custom officer's house to repossess their whisky, which seems to be like a very risky strategy. And obviously it didn't work out for them because they then got arrested. There's two final ones I'd like to tell you about from the High Court records, and there's different reasons for this. One is just an indulgence of mine, and this is from 1751. and this is a warrant to deliver Donald McPherson, who's a deserter from the army, to Inverness prison. What I love about this is there's a request sent to the commanding officer at Ruthven Barracks to supply armed men to escort Donald McPherson to Inverness. What I love, and Carolyn, I think, is in Kingussie, or is normally in Kingussie, you'll know this as well, but for those of you who know Ruthven Barracks just outside Kingussie, it is it's still a very substantial ruin, but it's a ruin, and it delights me to look at a document that says we're sending a request to the commanding officer of Ruthven Barracks to supply armed troops to escort someone to prison, because in all of our lifetimes that building has been a ruin, and it's just amazing to look at a tiny glimpse into when life was going on there, and it was a busy, active barracks. And then the last one I want to tell you is from 1753, and it's just really to show, having talked about all the hanging in chains and the executions and things, this is someone at the High Court being imprisoned for fishing on the Sabbath. Now, I just find that extraordinary that is seen to be on the same scale as all of these mass rapes and murders and killing of troops and things. But my guess is, and I don't know, but my guess is this is maybe a persistent offender, and they've just sort of kind of clamped down and said, no, you've gone too far. But interesting. I hope that's given some insight into the sorts of things that are found within court records. There are hundreds and hundreds of documents within our court collections, and they all give a glimpse into all sorts of things. As I say, occupations, social understanding of what was important at the time, punishments, all sorts of things. So I hope that this has given an insight into that subject. I'm going to round off by saying again that the livecast is brought to you free of charge by High Life Highland. There's no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and this event requires no payment and no subscription. If you're in a position to be able to do so, to donate towards the work of the service, we would very much appreciate that. There's a link to do so within the comments of this film. If you're able to do that, then we would appreciate it. Next week, we'll be looking at some further stories from the Great War. I know when I did the First World War I talk, there was a lot of interest, and I know it's a subject that people feel very, very connected to, especially as we say, we've come through all these recent commemorations and things, so it's a subject people care a lot about. So we'll be doing some further stories from the Great War. And again, just to highlight, as I did last week, that we'll be doing a virtual Doors Open Day event. So that's going to be on the weekend of the 5th and 6th of September. I've been having a lot of fun this week recording some interviews with some of my colleagues in the different offices who have different roles. And so there'll be about 8 or 9 films going out live over that weekend that you can hear some other voices other than mine, although I'll be on them, but talking about the different work that we do in the different collections that we hold. So I hope you can join us for those as well. If you're able to go onto our Facebook page and register interest in the event, then you'll get a notification for it. Thank you for all your nice comments, and thank you for my messages about my birthday. I'm taking the afternoon off. I'm going to eat cake. So you should all join me. I'll see you next week. Thank you.